And welcome to everybody here that is backstage with us. We are thrilled you are here. If you want to drop into the chat where you're from, I live here in central Pennsylvania in Mechanicsburg. And Jessica, you're out towards Pittsburgh, right?
I am, yeah. I grew up on the other side of the state out near Philadelphia. Went to
Right?
college at Happy Valley at Penn State in the middle of the state. Now I'm over on the West Coast, so I've got all Pennsylvania covered over the years.
There you go. So, what zone are you guys in that area?
Yeah, so we're kind of like borderline 5, 6.
Okay.
If we have a polar vortex, we're a solid 5. If we get off kind of like we did this year with a lot of snow, but not temperatures that were extreme, we're
Yeah.
closer to a 6. So
Yeah, yeah. So we're fortunate that we're close to the water here, being near the Susquehanna, and I have a pretty substantial creek in my backyard. So we're 7A, which is really amazing. But the snow just disappeared about a week ago. So I've been itching to get out in the garden, and I have a garden cat who likes to observe and supervise. So she's already taking me on 3 garden walks today, telling me everything we need to do. So,
someone has to be in charge, right?
right,
Might as well
exactly.
be a cat.
Absolutely. She's definitely my supervisor around here. Um, so great. Well, I am looking forward to this very much. So we'll give it a couple more minutes as people come in and get up on the pages. But I wanted to say congratulations. I saw your Horticultural Society Award for your book. That's so exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, they just made the official announcement yesterday.
Yay!
So I kind of they covertly let the winners and their publishers know a little bit ahead of time, so you can sort of line up your press and all that stuff. But they ask you to keep it quiet until they, officially post it up on the website and everything. So yesterday I got the word that they finally put it up. So it's very exciting. I won the AHS Book Award in 2014 for my book, Attracting Beneficial Bugs to the Garden.
Right.
So, it was just like, a lifetime sort of goal, but it wasn't even really a goal because I didn't ever think it was achievable, but it was just sort
Right.
of like one of those moments, right?
Yeah.
And then now to have it twice is like it's just a handful of people that have won it twice. And it's just for a person who is as into science as I am and really sort of enjoys all of the research aspect and researching the research, which is part of what I really love.
Right.
It's such an honor. Just it's very
Oh,
humbling and just such a crazy,
well,
incredible honor. And it couldn't have
congratulations.
come with better timing for this Facebook Live either.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, I'm super thrilled for all of you guys, and that's a huge, huge accomplishment. And obviously, to be recognized by your peers is, always very rewarding. That yes, I'm doing good things, and people who know how hard this is are saying, "Good job." So that's super exciting,
Yeah,
for
thank
sure. Well, yeah, and if you're backstage with us, thank you so much for being here. We're super excited to have you, and we'd love to know where we're hosting you from. So we both Jessica and I are here in Pennsylvania, although very different zones and very different parts of the state. I'm more central Pennsylvania, and she's western. So it impacts how you are gardening as to where you are located, because we still don't have warm enough ground temperatures here, at least in central Pennsylvania, to do a whole lot except some early spring vegetables that can actually take frost. So I'm praying that we get a little bit earlier last frost than we did last year. Last year, the spring was just so wet and cold here. I felt like a kid at Christmas though, because all of my milkweed was gorgeous and blooming, but it was like the cookies were out and Santa didn't show up. It took forever for those monarchs to get here.
they were really late last year in my garden too. I lost a patch, my big patch of swamp milkweed.
Oh
It
no.
didn't come back, and I don't know why because it's been in that same spot forever. But you know how swamp milkweed is; it tends to make babies every winter.
Right.
So I've certainly lots of other patches of the plant, but I think it was probably it might have been early August, mid August till I started to really see monarchs in earnest. We always have a ton of tiger swallowtails and fritillaries
Yep.
around our garden, because we have a sassafras tree, we have a tulip poplar tree, which are both host plants for the zebra eastern black swallowtail. So
Yep.
we see a lot of those. And then I have violets everywhere, right? Like, and
Right.
violets are the fritillaries.
Yep.
So people plant all this milkweed, and I'm like, you should also not be killing the violets that you come up in your garden,
Right.
because
Yeah.
just like the milkweed is sole host for the monarchs, so too are the violets for the fritillaries. So
Right.
so it's one of those things where monarch gets all the press, and it's a fabulous thing to give
Yep.
press to, obviously, but I don't want people to forget about all the other great butterflies.
Absolutely. And for the first time last year, I had planted pawpaws. And so I was able to get some zebra swallowtails that came in, and I literally was like jaw dropping, like, what are you doing here? So exciting when you finally get them to show up. You
Yeah.
plan it, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will come. So,
Right. It takes a while sometimes for them to go. And I've had borage in my vegetable garden that just sort of self-sows and comes up on its own since we've lived here pretty much for almost 15 years. And I've never seen a painted lady caterpillar on the borage plants ever. And last year we had 4 of them.
wow.
Different plants. And I actually had to look them up because I have never seen the painted lady
Right.
caterpillar before. So, and they kind of curl themselves up in the leaf,
Yep.
and sort of they spin a webbing to sort of sew it closed a little bit. So
Right.
that was really exciting. I mean, obviously we've had the butterflies around our garden for a very long time, but I've never had them on the borage. So
Yep. Yep.
thrilling when you see that.
It's fun once you realize where to look for them, that's for sure. And I see
Yeah.
Suzanne Tilton has joined us. She's the butterfly lady down in Texas, and she's saying that she saw several monarchs yesterday in Mission, Texas at the National Butterfly Center, as well as pipevine and giant swallowtails. I'm so jealous right now, Suzanne. You know that when we're allowed to travel again, you're on one of the first places I'm going to come visit, because she gets to see all these cool things down there. But I think one of the challenges is definitely to encourage people to leave some of the things they consider weeds. And I've lobbied for a long time. We probably need to have a monarch plant makeover. I mean, because almost everything that they like is a weed, and it's very hard for me to sometimes convince people to plant weeds.
Well, it has weed in the name, but that doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean that it's a
Right.
weed, right?
Exactly. But wouldn't it be better if we called it like monarch magic, or you know what I mean?
Right, butterfly flower, or
Yeah.
or
Just give it a name makeover,
milk
perhaps.
fly or something, or milk flower or something like that. Right. That would be better than milkweed. Yeah.
Hi, Christina from Muncie. We're super happy that you're here. And Ken is saying asters and goldenrod are important. 100%. You're going to hear us talk a little bit about that today, that you want to create a symphony of flowers throughout the season. And we're geeking out here about butterflies today, but I want to welcome everybody here, and those that are backstage. We're able to see your comments, so we're going to be commenting on what you guys are telling us too. But I am really thrilled to host Jessica Walliser, who recently wrote this stunningly gorgeous book called Plant Partners. She is a busy lady. She's a radio host. She's a horticulturist, scientist, and a book author. Really super excited to talk to her a little bit today about the science behind why we want to plant certain plants together, sometimes called companion planting. But I understand, Jessica, that scientists don't really like that. And so we're going to talk about plant partners today. So Jessica, welcome. We're so happy that you're here and joining our audience on The Thoughtful Gardener. And welcome, Savvy Gardener followers. We're happy you're both here.
Yes, thank you. I was so thrilled that you guys could cross stream this on the Savvy Gardening Facebook page, and then the Thoughtful Gardener Facebook page as well. It's pretty cool how technology can bring us all together for so many fun and educational things these days. It's pretty cool to see it all come. So there is some good, maybe, that's come out of all the craziness in this world lately. So
I completely agree. It's so much fun to be able to create a community where we can connect and we can share ideas and actually help each other out. I mean, certainly the pandemic raised the awareness of the importance of gardening. It became the #1 hobby in last year in 2020, and has continued into this year. A lot of the seed supply companies that I buy things from were on 1 month ship delays because they were already having banner first quarter seed selling due to the continued enthusiasm for gardens. And certainly, I think as people are aware that, supply chains can and do break down. We just saw in Texas a huge ice storm that surprise came in and disrupted the supply chain yet again. So I think a lot of people are trying to be conscientious, not only about wildlife habitat, but providing food for their families. So your book is really timely because many people don't have large spaces, but they'd like to be able to grow more food. And I'd like for you to talk about sort of the science in a short span of why there are these relationships between plants that help them grow better.
Yeah, so I mean, the term companion planting and the basic concept of companion planting has been around for a really long time, right? People have heard, oh, you always have to plant this plant next to this plant because it loves it, or whatever. That these partnerships have often been recommended. But as a horticulturist, I was always hesitant to recommend them myself because there was little to no science behind them. Most of them were based in folklore. There might have been some like iffy science behind them in terms of like looking at their crystalline structures and how they compared to each other and stuff like that. But there was no like serious modern research taking
Right.
place in those. But as a horticulturist, I also know that plants relate to each other in many different ways, right? So we know that underground they're linked through a massive fungal hyphae network, right, of these mycorrhizal fungi that come into the roots or attach to the outside of the roots. They can, we know the trees can communicate with each other through that fungal network. We know they can share resources with each other and with that network as well. So they relate to each other, right? Plants compete with each other for sunlight, for nutrients, for water. So we know there's all these ways they relate. So I thought, okay, well, we know plants relate to each other. So there has to be some research out there that looks at companion planting and whether or not the way they relate can result in positive growth or a positive outcome for one or both of those partners. So I started to kind of take a deep dive into the research. And what I found was that there is a boatload of research out there, but they don't call it companion planting because that term is so closely tied to the folklore side of it.
Right.
They instead refer to things like interplanting, intercropping, creating a polyculture. They talk about enhancing the diversity and biodiversity of your garden to create a more stable environment. So when I started looking at the research, those were the phrases and the terms that I was looking for because they all do mean companion planting. Interplanting is companion planting. Intercropping is companion planting. They're just not using that word. So that's the science that I looked at. And there's a load of it out there and distilled it down into partnerships that I really thought would most benefit home gardeners. Because I know that at your house, you're not going to plant, an entire field of rapeseed or an entire field of alfalfa, right? As a companion plant or a green manure. I
Right.
know you're going to do it on a smaller scale. So I distilled all that research down to what I thought would be useful to you and I.
Absolutely. And so it's interesting that we have heard a lot recently with different scientists doing studies to talk about how plants communicate with one another, very much like we're doing right now on the World Wide Web. Plants have communication systems through their root systems and this fungi. And so they can send messages to say, hey, there's danger ahead, right? And I'm warning you that there's danger ahead. So that then sometimes can attract good guys, right? The good pests might come in and help out with that invasion. Can you talk a little bit about not yet how these communications are going on and the positive side of that that can help protect your plants?
Sure. And so I think the important part to recognize is it's not just happening underground. It's not just through the fungal network that it's happening, but it's also actually in the air as well. So plants release volatile chemicals through their leaves all the time. And in their messages basically to each other, to the insect world, they're going on. Our noses, right? Our ciliary noses, they're not sensitive, nor have they evolved to pick up on these cues, but the insect world and the plant world certainly have. So there's these amazing communication networks that are going on constantly outside in the landscape. So it's really cool. Now, do we know that all plants do this? No, we don't, because we haven't studied all plants, right?
Right.
But there are plenty of plants out there that we've looked at. And I would say probably one of the coolest bits of research that I read years ago before I wrote my book, Good Bug, Bad Bug, was a study that took place at my alma mater, Penn State University. And it's where they looked at a cabbage plant, and the cabbage plant was being attacked by the imported cabbage worm, which are little green caterpillars that eat our cabbage plants. And when it was being attacked and eaten by that caterpillar, it released a volatile chemical called an HIPV. That's herbivore induced plant volatile. Herbivore induced means an herbivore, a plant eating bug is eating it, right? And when that cue goes off, then the cabbage plant was releasing a volatile chemical, an HIPV, into the air, which was the chemical composition of that HIPV was exactly targeted to attract the particular species of parasitic wasp that was most likely to come and feed on that imported cabbage worm. Now, if it was a diamondback moth that was eating that cabbage plant, the chemical composition of that HIPV was slightly different because it's a different species of parasitic wasp that uses the diamondback moth larva to house and feed their young.
Wow.
So it's this system. So, right, I have a tulip poplar in my backyard. It got infested a couple years ago with aphids, right? And all these amazing ladybugs, all these different species of ladybugs showed up to help control those aphids. And they showed up because my tulip poplar, Liriodendron, has been one of the ones that's been studied, a tree that's been studied. It releases HIPVs. So the tree was sending out basically an SOS, right? To get all those
Right.
ladybugs to come and feed on those aphids. So it's a
Amazing.
really cool, and now there's like a whole other level of it that we're discovering, right? Because the tomato fruit worm, now they just somebody just released a study that the tomato fruit worm is eating the tomato plant. So the tomato plant releases the HIPV, but the tomato fruit worm has now developed a compound in its saliva that shuts down the release of those
Wow.
HIPVs. Right? So it's all of these layers of intricate relationships and communications, and it's like it's
That's
mind-blowing.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a warning system that says, hey, somebody is eating me. In fact, this guy is eating me. So I need these guys who prey on this bad guy to come get him.
Right.
And now the bad guys are like, now, wait a minute, I'm going to mask myself. And that way you won't know who to send.
Right.
Just
Right.
incredible.
It really is. And
Incredible.
the plants aren't, they don't think the way we think, right? So it's not like they're, are they intentionally releasing this? There's lots of people who are like, no, that's humanizing them. You can't, talk in terms of, but like to make it connectable and relatable to humans, that's like the way to explain it, right? That they're calling in the truths. So
Right.
your original question was, well, then how can we gardeners take this knowledge and use it to help us be better gardeners, right? And
Right.
the answer is to just realize that we don't belong in that system, right?
Right.
That's been going on long before we humans showed up. So our goal and our mission should be to foster that,
Right.
to let it happen, and to give it time to happen, because nothing in nature happens like that. It all takes
Absolutely.
time. So when we see, let's say aphids on our lettuce plants in the vegetable garden, don't automatically squish them with your fingers or reach for a spray can or even
Right.
knock them off the plant with a, stream of water. Don't do that right away. Sit back, watch and see who shows up to eat them, because I guarantee you, if you give it a week or two, there's going to be a ton of beneficial insects that come to help control those aphids. And we just
Absolutely.
have to take ourselves out of the equation.
Absolutely. And I always promote, a chemical free or reduced system because I have a cat, as we talked about, and she is in the garden when I'm there and she's susceptible, sadly. We don't know what triggers her, but we do know she has an environmental trigger for her genetic condition. And so we've chosen not to use any chemicals in our home where she lives, as well as outside in our yard. But last year I had cabbage worms terribly who were feasting on my kale. And instead of using a chemical solution like BT, instead I would just go out with a dinner plate every morning and I would pluck them and take them to my bird feeder. And nature's hot dogs were gone in about 5 minutes. So I want to encourage all the gardeners here, as Jessica said, to wait for the cavalry, but if they're decimating your vegetables, there may be a non-chemical solution. And one of the most efficient ways is to pluck those caterpillars. Your birds who are trying to feed nestlings will say thank you for
They
sure.
will, and there's always a solution to these problems that's not based in synthetic chemical pesticides. I mean, there's every single time there is, and so like in my garden for my kale plants, they're always covered with floating row cover because
Right,
that way the cabbage worms can't get them on in the first place, right? So,
right,
and I don't want to give the impression to people that I'm like, forcing them to have their garden all chewed to pieces. And I'm
right.
certainly not saying that by any means, but for some of these pests that we have a fit over when there's just one or two on them, the one or two is the start of getting all the good guys to arrive. And of course, it's often a different story too when we're talking about a pest that was imported, one that didn't
Sure.
evolve here. So it doesn't have a lot of natural predators here, whether that's the emerald ash borer or the brown marmorated stink bug, on the West Coast, it might be the Mediterranean fruit fly. We've got lots of pests that have been imported here. And so
Right.
when there are no natural checks and balances predators there, then that's oftentimes when we have to step in with either a physical control, a mechanical control, or a product control, because they're just not going to be that number of predators for them.
Completely agree. And here in Pennsylvania, our county was just added last year for the spotted lanternfly. And we know there are really no great solutions at this point to controlling them, although there have been some very innovative solutions to catching them. Fortunately, I haven't seen them yet, but we know they're coming. And then this year, we will have cicadas coming, the hatching. So again, not going to damage your garden, unlike a spotted lanternfly, but a nuisance bug for a lot of people and scary looking. What do we do to help with trying to protect some of these plants by planting these partner plants? So, for example, one of the ones I have in my garden that I absolutely love because I also eat them is Nasturtiums. So, can you talk a little bit about masking and how some of these plants are great to consider, not only to attract the pollinators and get more yield, but to also prevent or mask the things you want to protect?
Sure. So, I mean, while there's lots of different goals of companion planting and plant partnership, I point out that there's basically 7 different goals. The one that people tend to most, be interested in, and the one that they're sort of find the easiest to employ in their garden is plant partnerships for pest control and pest management. And that can be done in a couple different ways. You mentioned masking, where people will say, oh, well, you always have to plant your dill with your tomatoes because you won't get hornworms if you do that, right?
Right.
So is that a real valid partnership? If it is, why does it work? How does it work? So it always used to be that we would think that, like, okay, if I plant my marigolds with my lettuce, the smell of the marigold will keep the pests away. But research is actually pointing to the fact that that's probably not the way that that works.
Right.
It probably works more so that the scent of that one plant masks the scent of the other plant. So not that it itself drives the pest away, but that it is hiding, right, the host plant for that particular vegetable that you want to save, right? So
Right.
there's lots of different examples. So that's one way. We can also lure pests away by using a trap crop.
Right.
to help. So we want to send them over there, send the pest over there to leave the desired crop alone. That's another way to do it. We can use plant partners to, we can put a hedgerow up, right? Which
Right.
might keep pests from moving into the garden, right? It sort of forms that barrier. So lots of ways that we can do that. And in the book, I also point out some really specific combinations that you can employ. And the one that everybody always, you mentioned the nasturtiums, and this is the one, and it's featured on the cover because it's really cool. And if you grow squash, whether it's summer squash or winter squash, you know that squash bugs and squash vine borers are always problematic on those plants,
Right.
right? Well, a really cool study out of Iowa State University, they looked at the numbers of squash bugs when the squash was interplanted with nasturtiums. And what they found was that there was a significant reduction in squash bugs and squash vine borers when those two plants were planted as companions in the vegetable garden.
Which is
So,
really important
yeah,
too if you're in a community garden. My parents live in a retirement community, and she does her vegetable garden in a community garden. And she told me, I've pretty much given up on squash because the squash bugs are getting from other plots into my plot, and it's destroying my squash. So I'm just going to give up. So I'm glad that there's some hope that she could actually grow squash, because I love squash casserole, and that's sort of when I go home, that's what I want to eat. So I'm really excited to tell her this solution if she's not on right now. Hi, Mom, if you are. But the bottom line is that, if you've had issues before, some of these trap crops or mass crops can really maybe be a solution and give you an opportunity to try it again.
exactly. And so one of the ones that is often brought up sort of again in this sort of classic companion planting is the tomatoes and basil. And
Right.
everyone's, oh, you got to plant your tomatoes and basil together. They go really well on the plate. So therefore they should go really well together in the garden. And so that's one of the things I specifically looked for that plant partnership and to see if there was any science backing that up. And I did. I found two studies that one found that when you plant basil with your tomatoes, that it was a reduction in the egg laying behaviors of the tomato and tobacco hornworm.
Fantastic.
So that was number one. The other one that it looked at was thrips.
Yeah.
And thrips they're not problematic in my garden, but they certainly are for other gardeners. And they looked at both tomatoes and peppers. And what they found was that when they were interplanted with the basil, that we had a reduction. There was a reduction in the damage from thrips as well. So there was a classic plant partnership that's been recommended for years, and there was actually some good scientific backing for it. So that one was exciting to come across.
It's always great when you can actually point to the science of what you're doing and be able to take some of the high level research that's going on at Rutgers and Penn. We're so excited to have these educational agricultural schools around us, because we can utilize that information to make informed decisions. And I love what you talk about regarding soil health. Soil health is so important because that's where this really gets started. A lot of your issues can be solved by doing things on purpose to manipulate the soil to prevent the bad guys from moving in. And one of the things you talk about is green manure. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that. That might be a new term for some people in our audience.
Yeah, so cover crops, that's like another term that's often used. And it's basically, it is a plant partnership. It is companion planting. Many people think companion planting has to be plant A with plant B, and they have to be in the same space at the same time. And that's not what modern companion planting is. Modern companion planting is two partners or more. It can be 5, 6, 7. It can be a whole plant community that you're creating. And they don't have to be in the same space at the same time. And that's what happens with cover crops or green manures, right? That plant, in most cases, is planted either before or after your desired crop to see the benefits. So a cover crop is a crop that's put in that is grown, and its purpose is generally to enhance your soil conditions, right?
Right.
If it's a leguminous or a member of the pea and bean family, it can add nitrogen into that soil. If it's a grain crop, when you cut it down, it will form like a mat on the soil, and that will help with weed control as well. So that whole soil preparation and conditioning, there's one of the very first chapters in the book talks about plant partnerships that deal with those kind of combos to really help soil. And the sad part, I think, sometimes about companion plant or about cover crops is that home gardeners are very intimidated by them. They often think that cover crops are only for farmers and they
Right.
don't have enough space, or they've had problems with them in the past because they got weedy or something like that,
Right.
right? And and that shouldn't be the case. A lot of times if someone has trouble with a cover crop becoming weedy, it's because, I hate to say this, but they didn't do it right. The gardener didn't follow the rules.
Right.
Because if you follow the guidelines and you select the best cover crop for the job, you plant it properly in the right timing, you treat it properly when it flowers before it goes to seed. This is really important. You have to mow it down at exactly the right time or it does become weedy.
Right.
And once you know the art of cover cropping, it doesn't matter if you just have a 4x8 raised bed in the backyard. You can take great advantage of the practice of cover cropping. You just have to take the time to learn how to do it right.
Yeah, and last year I had a strip where I was going to be putting fruit trees in, and I needed to increase the nitrogen in the soil because the soil was very depleted where it was going to go at the base of a wall. And so I used crimson clover, which was not only stunningly gorgeous when it bloomed, this sea of red, one of the very first things to bloom in the garden, but I can tell you the early pollinators went crazy over it. You would not believe the number of bees that were present on that cover crop. So not only is it doing great things for your soil, but it's also providing some of those early emergers something to eat.
And a habitat, sort of those low growing, sort of wide spreading cover crops like that are excellent habitat for minute pirate bugs, big-eyed bugs, damsel bugs, spiders, all of these predaceous insects that help us manage pests in the orchard and the vegetable garden. That's all amazing habitat for them. Now, did your crimson clover overwinter where you are, or was it winter killed?
So it did overwinter. So last year, if you remember, we had a very, very mild winter. So I planted it in the fall. It actually evergreened through the spring, and then I cut it down once it started to look pretty weedy. At that point, we cut it down. But then I replaced it with a low grow pollinator mix from Peaceful Valley.
Right.
And what you're just talking about actually saved me in swallowtails last year, because I had put a swallowtail nursery in the year before and my birds figured that out. And so I went out early in the spring and I'm seeing all these fat caterpillars and I was so excited. And the next morning they were gone. And I'm like, okay, they were clearly a snack because I have a lot of nestlings, but that low grow mix had a lot of herbs in it, including parsley, which they love. And so they were hiding in the orchard and a little bit more protected than out in the garden where the birds could see them. So I really love this idea of low grow pollinator mix. It was, if you look up peacefulvalley.com, they're out of California, but they have wildflowers and herbs that are suitable for your area. You just look for what you're trying to accomplish.
That's an interesting observation that you made, right there, where you said, the parsley was kind of hidden among other plants. And when you think about it, especially for like butterfly gardening, the plants that they naturally use as host plants for their young are not like islands in a sea of mulch naturally. They're part of plant communities.
Right.
And so when we are planting our gardens, whether it's an ornamental garden or a vegetable garden, we should be planting in plant communities so that no plant is an island by itself, which
Right.
basically is a big signal for either pests or, in that case, for the birds to come and find that caterpillar. When we
Exactly.
plant it closely with other plants, the way they're meant to be in nature, in a diverse environment, that's where we have the benefits of encouraging the good bugs and the benefit of detracting from the pests as well. So your vegetable garden, modern vegetable gardens, should not be a row of cabbage, a row of peppers, a row of tomatoes, a row of onions. That is not how we should be planting our vegetable garden.
Agreed.
We should be planting them in mimicking a natural wild ecosystem with mixed plantings together. If you're harvesting with a piece of equipment, like they do on a commercial farm, that's when you have to plant in a row. But you're going out and you're cutting off a cabbage to make for dinner, one cabbage, or you're pulling two peppers off of the vine. And so it doesn't matter if you have to go from this raised bed to that raised bed to harvest two peppers, because the benefits that you're going to see by growing in a mixed environment where there's flowers and there's herbs and there's annuals and there's root vegetables mixed with leafy vegetables mixed with fruiting vegetables, all of those combined in a mixed environment is going to be the most stable place for your plants to grow. That makes them less prone to pest outbreaks. It makes pollinators easier. They can forage easier because it's a shorter flight from plant to plant, right?
Absolutely.
It doesn't deplete your soil. Like, there's just so many benefits of gardening that way. That's how I want everybody's vegetable garden to look.
Yep, I definitely agree with you. I see a lot less pests because I mix things up, but also too, because as a Southern gardener moving to the Northeast, imagine my surprise that you guys have a frost date until May 15th, and I had to really juice my garden. So I figured out early on something I learned from my granddaddy Andrews, which is if you can attract more pollinators to your garden, you can grow more food. And actually some data that is out of both Clemson University and Rutgers University supports that a 30% increase in yield by having these pollinator hedgerows. And so I purposely plant both herbs as well as native pollinator plants in my vegetable garden so that they will come in and they will help pollinate my vegetables too. So my neighbors have been my victims of that, where I have threatened if they don't come get a bunch of tomatoes and squash, I'm going to ring the doorbell, leave a package, and run away, because the yield is so high. That first year, my one squash plant, I had over 50 crookneck squash from that one plant. So squash casserole was kind of getting a little out of control at my house. So my friends and family got to benefit from that.
Yeah, that's good. And in Plant Partners, I actually have a whole chapter dedicated to partnerships like that to encourage pollinators, because people get so stuck on the honeybee, right, which is
Right.
not a native pollinator; it's a
Right.
European. But yet there's almost 4,000 species of native bees here in
That's
North
right.
America, and they're more efficient pollinators in many cases than the European honeybees are. They forage earlier in the day. Many of them are specialized, where they'll pollinate like just a certain group of plants or family of plants. And so, like if we look at those squashes, your beloved squashes, they're pollinated most efficiently by a fantastic native bee known as the squash bee.
Right.
And the squash bee is a solitary nester. It often builds a brood chamber in the ground, just one female all by herself, right underneath your squash plants. And the best way to attract them is to have more squash plants, because they're a specialist pollinator. That's the only plant they pollinate, right? So you have to also look at which species of bees pollinate which particular crops. So like our nightshades, which would be the tomatoes and eggplants and peppers, they are self-pollinating, but they require the buzz pollination of a bumblebee to knock the pollen loose within that flower. So wind can do it. You bumping against the plant can knock that pollen loose as well, but it's most efficiently done by the bumblebees. So if we plant other plants and flowers in the garden that support those bumblebees, like big fat tubular flowers like foxgloves or something like that, or something with a wide landing pad like a cone flower, right?
Yes.
If we boost our numbers and partner those plants tailored to bumblebees, then we're going to have better fruit set on our tomatoes and peppers. So lots of little cool things like that.
Absolutely. And the native bees, I love that you have a chapter in your book specifically to talk about the native bees, because it's something I'm super passionate about here. Certainly on our channel, we talk about how in the state of Pennsylvania, the most recent data out of Rutgers University shows that they add about $1.5 billion to our agriculture in pollinating plants. And so we do want to do what we can do to support them. But unlike a honeybee, as Jessica was just mentioning, they live in the ground, and mine have created a little hotel of holes that are beside a tree line, but just adjacent to that is my pollinator garden. So they don't have far to fly. But you know, my husband will come home from work some days and he's like, "Oh, there's a lot of bees here right now." And I just tell people when they're in the garden, a lot of these native bees are not aggressive. They could care less that I'm there. I've never been stung. I'm like, if you feel like you're getting nervous, just hum. They, unless you're going to catch them, they're really not interested in stinging you. They have nothing to protect. They're not protecting a nest, unlike a honeybee does,
And
right?
many of them can't sting. I mean, they don't even have a stinger, many of
Right.
them. So they're just super docile. I mean, I put a video on Facebook, I don't know, it might have been 2 years ago, of me petting a bumblebee, because that's like I love to do. Bumblebees and carpenter bees, when they're out on my Monarda, like they're so into that flower, and the phlox as well. They're just, I mean, they're on a mission to get their nectar. And so you can literally reach out and pet them. Like
That's so cool.
my son's allergic, so we always have an EpiPen in the house. You know, we're
Right.
always aware.
Right.
But the honeybees, you know, even them, you have to step on them or squish them really to get stung. It's, you know, sometimes in the fall, at least, I feel like it's the paper wasps, the European
Yeah.
paper wasps and yellow jackets, who are the guys that are out to get us, because they're trying to protect their queen, you know.
Right.
So I don't blame them for that.
Yeah.
But the sad part is that the bees often get blamed for something that really isn't their fault. So
I completely agree. And I have a flowering raspberry that bumblebee that you're talking about, that beat, that vibration, I can hear them. They're so in that flower, spinning around and around like a top, trying to get covered in pollen. And it's just fun to figure out where the noise is coming from, because they're working so hard. They are completely ignoring me when I'm out there looking for them. But it's just a delight to be able to watch all of this activity that's in your garden. So I highly recommend take your morning coffee or your, you know, whatever. If you've got to take your afternoon break outside, we know that at least with COVID, that 80% of the patients were vitamin D deficient. So go gardening. None of the gardeners here should be vitamin D deficient. But I saw that there's a question here from Christina about, are there natural or native wildflower gardens or diverse gardens? So are we saying to diversify with native pollinator plants, or are we saying diversify with wildflowers? I'd argue both. What's your experience, Jessica?
yeah, so this was one thing that I actually did quite a bit of research on for my previous book, Attracting Beneficial Bugs to Your Garden, because I wanted to look at the science. You know, we often hear people say, you know, you have to plant natives because, you know, they're the only thing that's going to provide the, you know, habitat or the right kind of nectar and all this stuff. And so I thought, well, again, I want to look at studies or that. So there's a lot of emerging science on that. We do know that certainly in the case of specialist pollinators, where they only, you know, pollinate one family or one specific species of plant, then yeah, there's very little wiggle room there in terms of what kind of plants they need. They need that plant, right? That's what they need. But more of our generalist pollinators, like our bumblebees and some of the sweat bees and things that will pollinate, you know, there's lots of species that are specialists, but there's also lots of species that are not specialists.
Right. They're more generalists.
Right. Exactly. And they're attracted to whatever fits their morphology, right? They need a flower that fits their mouth part in order to drink the nectar from it. So
Right.
I get caught with this question, and
Yeah.
here's why: because I want you to plant natives.
Yeah.
I want you to plant as many natives as you possibly can. Do I want to shun you for planting non-natives? Of
No.
course not. I'm just happy that you planted something.
Yeah.
But I do want you to opt for native, you know, if that's an option for you, and it is an option for everybody, obviously. I want you to go as native as you possibly can. But yeah, I got peonies in my garden. Nobody
Absolutely.
pollinates them. You know, they can't even reach the nectaries because they're so buried in all of those petals.
Right.
But you know, they bloom for a couple weeks a year. But then I also am not going to feel bad for having peonies, because I
Yeah.
have literally hundreds of other plants in my garden that the bees absolutely adore.
Absolutely. And I'm the same, Jessica. I'm not a purist. My grandmother's peonies happily reside in my garden, and they're very special to me because they're an heirloom. And certainly Doug Talley would tell you too, we're not asking you to dig up your yard or dig up all of your plants that are traditional landscape plants. But what we are saying is that as those plants start to decline, or if you're looking to convert part of your lawn, that ideally at least 70% of your garden would start to become native, because we do have challenges right now with supporting these native pollinators. And certainly in the West, because of the recent weather as well as the fires, for monarchs specifically, when they did the count through Monarch Watch last year, that population sadly has almost completely collapsed. So the East Coast is really the driving engine right now to keep these monarchs alive. And so everything you can do to plant their host plants, which we talked about, milkweed, but also the high nectar plants and that are natives, that will definitely help attract them to your garden. I certainly got a question about this in my Master Gardener class, because somebody was like, well, I planted milkweed, but they didn't show up. And so I said, well, can I ask you about your nectar sources? And she said, well, I've got iris and I've got daylilies. And I said, unfortunately, those just don't have enough of the what they're looking for. So, you've got to attract them to come eat, and then they'll lay their eggs. So you want to look for those, what I would call high nutrient dense plants that will attract them. So certainly, you've done, thank you so much. This has been so informative. I feel like I've learned so much in just a little bit of time, but sometimes we don't have great soil, right? So some of the plants you're talking about are soil builders and rototillers. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe you're just getting started and your soil is just hard as a rock? What are some things that people can do to perhaps improve their soil conditions so that these plants can thrive?
Sure. So, in Plant Partners, again, in that chapter that's dedicated to soil conditioning and soil preparation, I talk about a group of plants known as living rototillers, where they're planted with the purpose of opening up channels within the soil where nutrients and water can better get down to the roots of your desired plants. So, one of the best ways to do this with heavy clay soils, which is what we have here in Western Pennsylvania too, is with forage radish. And forage radish are not like the little tiny radish that we eat in our salads, but they're a long, deep, very thick taproot. And when we plant the forage radish in the fall, it grows this deep, long taproot, and then over the winter it dies. It's killed off by freezing temperatures and kind of rots in place. And when that happens, that long, narrow tunnel remains open as a channel within the soil, and it stays that way. And then when you plant in it the next year, it basically changes the way your soil aggregates. It changes its structure, and it makes it more welcoming to crops going in afterwards. And depending on how early you plant them in the fall, those roots can go really deep, and they open up those channels really deep down into the soil. And I'm a no-till gardener. And I have been for about 10 years here. Yep. So my entire vegetable garden, I don't till.
Same here.
And I haven't in many years. So when I'm using my cover crops or my living rototillers, I'm planting species that are going to die over the winter here in Pennsylvania. Obviously, right. It's a different story if you're gardening down in Georgia or Louisiana, where you might not get freezing temperatures that are, low enough to kill those plants. But so it's choosing the right crop for where you live. Same thing with my cover crops. I mow them down right after they're done flowering and right before they start to develop their seeds. Right. That's when you mow them down. They won't resprout that way. If you do too right. early, they're going to sprout. If you do too late, they're going to drop seed. Yeah. So it's a very careful dance, very careful timing, but it's nothing but success when you do it right.
Absolutely. And certainly if you're interested in the no-dig method, I do offer a spring course, and I'm happy to help you. You can go to gardenthoughtfully.com, and we'd be happy to send you information once that course is available. But I think a lot of us, even the native master gardeners, are moving away from tilling because it does destroy that soil structure that we started this conversation with. That fungi and that soil structure is so important, especially for when you're going to be reusing that soil year after year. So one last question we had here backstage was about, Daikon radishes. When is the appropriate time to plant them here in Pennsylvania?
Sure. So, Daikon radishes are grown more primarily for a food crop.
Right.
So, they're just like regular radishes, they're a cool season crop. So once we get to maybe August and the days get shorter, towards the end of August, the temperatures start to drop off a little bit. That's a good time to start putting those radishes in. You can use daikons, but if you're going to use them for living rototillers, I would do the forage radishes, which are beefier and longer tapered. They're not going to be you're not going to be eating them anyway. They're
Right.
also typically a lot cheaper to buy than daikon radish seeds. So, forage radish is meant to be planted as, forage for animals or as a living rototiller. So seeds are a lot less expensive.
I completely agree. So, Jessica, I think this has been an unbelievable conversation. We're going to take some questions backstage. So feel free to put those in the chat if you'd like to ask Jessica a question about something you learned here, or maybe something that you've got going on in your garden that you're trying to resolve. But where can people get Plan Partners if they're interested in getting a copy of the book? Where would you recommend that they do that?
Sure. So they can get it pretty much any book retailer out there. They can actually go, if they want, to our Savvy Gardening page. There's a little tab up there on savvygardening.com that says buy our books, and they can click there. And that's an affiliate link. So we get a little bonus when people order from that. So that would be great. But certainly Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Target, Walmart, anywhere that, bookshop.org, your local independent bookseller. Anywhere you buy books, you can get this book.
Perfect. Well, I am so thrilled to have had the opportunity to read it, and we do have record of here's who's here backstage. So we will be drawing a name and sending you guys an email to let you know one person backstage here is going to win a copy of your book. So thank you so much for being generous with the audience and sharing that here. But I hope that we can have you back. This has been a really fun conversation, and I'm sure during the growing season, we'll get a lot more questions about how we can partner up so we can increase our yield and reduce the pest pressures on our properties. So really appreciate you being here, and lots of kudos back here backstage. So thank you so much for joining us today here.
Thank you so much, Heather. It was my pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and I'm glad you find it useful. And, you can always get me on Savvy Gardening. If you're doing plant combos and you've got interesting things to report, just send them my way because I love to hear about them.
Fantastic. So savvygardening.com and gardenthoughtfully.com. Both of us has Facebook pages as well. Jessica, what's your Facebook page? Is it the same?
Yeah, you can do Savvy Gardening, or I actually have a individual page as well, just Jessica Walliser. So real easy to find.
Fantastic. Well, and for the folks in the backstage, our amazing behind the scenes, Alyssa is put the link for the Amazon so you can get that there. And we just appreciate you being here, and have garden thoughtfully. Nice to meet you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.